Hello everybody. This is gonna be an interesting one. We're talking about the Holodomor and whether it was a genocide or not. And then we will go meta and explore why we even ask ourselves that. Exciting! I already know that there will be some people in the comments, usually with anime Stalin avatars, telling me that Holodomor is a propaganda name and I should call it the Soviet famine of 1932 and 33. But that's a mouthful, and when I say Holodomor, everybody familiar with the event knows what I mean. So let's talk about the thing that happened and not about how to call it. I think there's a non-zero chance that some viewers may not have heard about the Holodomor before. In that case, stick around for a minute, I'll get to it. The Holodomor is a very controversial issue among leftists, and many others, to be honest. To some, it is merely a famine which unfortunately killed millions. To some, it is proof that the government of the USSR was cruel and idealistic. And to some, it was a deliberate extermination of Ukrainian people, a genocide. And others used this tragedy to blame socialism in general and Stalin in particular. I agree with some of them and not with others. For this video, I will use the following approach. I will go over the undeniable facts. This part should not be controversial to any side. Then I will talk about how I used to think about it, what I thought it should have been remembered as, and then I will summarize why some think it was a genocide, why others disagree, and a frighteningly similar event that happened at the same time, and why we don't argue about that one. In this video, unlike my other ones, I will not try to convince you of one position. I want to communicate to you what people believe, as well as why they believe it. And I want you to decide between those. I will mention how I used to think about it, but I want you to form your own independent decision this time. No Wikiist party line here. This video will be controversial. Of course, I made controversial videos in the past. Look at my China or even North Korea videos to see that. But this one is really controversial, which I know because last week my entire Discord server tore itself apart over whether or not the Holodomor was a genocide or not. This topic has been on my idea list for a while already, but the heated exchanges on my Discord server were the trigger for me to getting myself together and writing this video. Naturally, when I announced this, both sides of the argument sent me more sources than I can possibly work through without a team of researchers. So don't take this video as a primary source. I will cite my sources in the top left and I will mention possible corrections in a pinned comment. But in the end, this is a YouTube video made in my bedroom, not a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Also, this video is demonetized, just like the last 3 successful ones. YouTube just hates when I talk about important topics, so remember to subscribe and donate and such. You know the deal. That all being said, let's finally ask ourselves, what the hell is a Holodomor? Essentially, it is a word to describe a famine, which happened in 1932 and 1933, specifically in Ukraine. The famine had effects outside of this, but the term Holodomor specifically describes what happened in Ukraine. This section is a summary of the facts we can be sure about. Sure, there are some who say there was no famine at all, but for all intents and purposes, they are conspiracy theorists and will be ignored here. The word is derived from the Ukrainian moriti holdom, which means to kill with hunger. Naturally, this word is only used by a certain type of person, that being the ones who believe it was a deliberate to make the Ukrainian people suffer, making it a genocide. The reason they can say that is of course that Ukraine wasn't an independent state at the time. It was a part of the Soviet Union, which meant that the Ukrainian government, by extension the people of Ukraine, were under the control of the government in Moscow. I have a video explaining the state structure of the USSR in detail, but for this part, you just need to know that Moscow made the decisions and Ukraine just had to suck it. At this time, Stalin was in power, and he was working on his goal of industrialization with the first 5-year plan. This plan moved farmers to cities, completely restructuring the ownership of land and punishing those peasants that were called kulaks. Historians argue about how much of a role this played in the famine, but it would be dishonest of me not to mention it. In 1913, so only shortly before the famine, the Soviet government began a policy of grain requisition. This means that they would take grain from farmers directly to increase grain export. This was done because the central government feared farmers may hide grain to sell it on the black market later. Naturally, the Red Army units tasked with requisitioning grain had their quotas to fulfill, which, by the way, most farms were not able to fulfill, while still having enough food to survive for the next year. But the units would do anything to follow their orders, because not doing so would mean punishment. So if needed, they would take more grain than the farmers had to spare. Then, in 1932, there was a drought, reducing crop yields in the southern Soviet Union. This caused a famine which was creatively named the Soviet Famine of 1932 and 33. It killed multiple million people all across the grain-producing areas in the USSR. I mean, just look at this image. The exact death toll varies widely depending on who you ask. But luckily for both of us, the numbers do not matter in the slightest because numbers don't make a genocide. During all this suffering and mass starvation, the central government did nothing. There were available grain reserves and the Soviet Union even exported grain during this period. I can see two explanations for this. Either the government genuinely didn't care, or worse, even deliberately left the Ukrainians die, or alternatively, they had no clue what was happening. There are letters from local governments in Ukraine painting completely different pictures. One talks about millions starving and the next talks about how there is more than enough grain. It's possible that the Soviet government was genuinely in the dark on this. This reminds me of the Great Chinese Famine, in which the main issue was that the local government leaders weren't reporting on starvation because it would make them look bad because they didn't reach their quota, which means the central government got no info on the happenings at worst and contradictory information at best. This is even more exemplified by the fact that the Soviet Union produced about 55 million tons of grain in the preceding year, while the reported production was almost 70 million. That's a huge difference. And that may or may not have caused the central government to believe that the situation was a lot less dire than it actually was. And of course, when there were reports of people literally hiding grain in their own family graves to save some so they may survive until the next harvest, the Soviet government put this down to greedy kulaks, not desperate starving people. The official Soviet view on the famine was that there was no famine, so talking about it would get you punished for anti-Soviet propaganda. This is also why the Soviet government accepted none of the aid that was offered by foreign countries. Accepting it would mean admitting they fucked up big time. So, as a summary, the Holodomor was a famine in 1932 and 33, in which millions of people starved, and the main factors were a drought, a 5-year plan, a policy of grain requisition with way too high quotas, bad communication between the government organs, and a complete lack of emergency action taken by Stalin's government. Now, the question remains of whether this was a genocide. Whether it was one or not, the famine was undoubtedly a horrific event in the history of the 20th century, and I don't want to come off like I don't respect the dead of the famine. Arguing about whether it was a genocide or not can sometimes seem like the people don't respect or care about the suffering of those who died in the famine. I will now talk about many definitions and legal arguments, but at no point will I play down the suffering of the affected. Just because it may not be a genocide doesn't mean it wasn't a horrible tragedy. If I had made this video a month ago, it would have been very different. It would have looked something like this. First mentioning the historical facts, just as I did here. Then I would have pulled up the definition of genocide by the UN and spent the rest of the video trying to argue for why the historical events didn't match the definition and therefore it can't be a genocide. Actually, let's make that argument right now, because it will come up anyways as soon as we get into the arguments for and against genocide. Note that while I will express this as if it is my opinion, it's not anymore. I learned since then. The official definition of genocide was set down by the UN in the Genocide Convention of 1984. It reads, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We can easily rule out A, B, D, and E. The only debatable one is C. So the question is, did the government of the USSR starve Ukrainians with the intent to destroy this national group? In other words, did they want Ukrainians to die for the sake of killing off Ukrainians? Of course, letting them starve in a natural famine while holding on to grain reserves also matches this definition, as long as it is deliberate. So the question remaining is there any evidence that Stalin and or his government wanted Ukrainians to die? You could argue that them exporting grain and setting such high quotas may have been done with the intention to harm Ukrainians. But that sentence includes the word may, which is not proof of intent, it's speculation. Personally, I always use the burden of proof, as it is used in Western justice systems. That says that we need to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt before we can declare someone guilty. This means even if in effect millions of Ukrainians died because of decisions by Stalin and the government, and even if the natural famine was made worse by the actions of the government, and even if the government was aware of this starvation and didn't feed the starving people, it was only a genocide if we can prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, the intention of the supposed perpetrators. For the legal system, the intent matters more than the effect. If you run someone over on purpose, that is killing. If you run someone over on accident, that's manslaughter. And those carry widely different jail terms, even though they look completely the same from the outside and impart the same suffering on the family of the dead person. It's all about intent. And the issue is, most arguments of people trying to prove that the Holodomor was exacerbated intentionally can be explained away. You could say that they kept exporting grain, knowing about the suffering, but that doesn't prove that they meant to kill people. It could just as much be that they let them die because they didn't want to break their delivery contracts, which I will admit, morally, are very close to the same thing, killing and letting die. But I saw this as a legal issue, not a moral one. And the problem is, you can explain away all pro-genocide arguments. For example, you can say that it's impossible to prove that the grain quotas were set to starve people, and that it's just as possible that the quotas were set to meet the goals of the industrialization. The burden of proof that the killing was intentional is on the ones pointing out that these quotas very likely killed people. Even the letters that show Stalin asking for more grain requisition in the middle of the famine, which he was presumably aware of, don't prove that Stalin wanted to kill Ukrainians. At least not beyond a reasonable doubt. So that was my answer. It wasn't a genocide because there is not enough proof to establish a motive. What I would have wanted was some letter from Stalin to the local leaders that said to take so much that the people would starve. But there is no such letter. Therefore, we can't prove the intention. That was my view before this last week. I did a lot of arguing and a lot of thinking since then, and I no longer think it's that simple. So I hope you've not called me a genocide denier in the comments yet, because I'm about to explain the flaws with that view, which I just spent 5 minutes explaining. Let's first talk about assumptions. I immediately assumed that the question of whether something is genocide or not hinges on how you define genocide. But I also immediately looked at it as a legal question, not a moral one. So for me it was all about whether it was technically legally a genocide, while others would infer that from the amount of suffering it caused. And millions of deaths is a lot of suffering. Besides deciding that issue was a legal one, I also decided that I should use the definition from the UN. This is, of course, because the UN definition is legally binding around the world, at least most of it. But is that right? Why do we follow the UN definition at all? Is it not just an appeal to authority? What if their definition is wrong? For example, the UN definition doesn't count forced sterilization of trans people as genocide, even though it is deliberately preventing a specific social group from reproduction, which matches the definition, but trans people aren't a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So we should ask ourselves if the UN definition should maybe include LGBT people and other hard to define social groups. And if not, why? Another objection is the fact that the UN definition hinges on intention. And as I mentioned before, in the law, it is very common to distinguish between deliberate and non-deliberate action. But if we forget about our assumed legal framework for a moment, we have to ask ourselves why that is. In the end, people suffered and died. Do we really want to let people off the hook because it was incompetence, or worse, just because they say it was incompetence and we can't disprove it? Or even negligence, right? There is evidence that Stalin and his government were aware of the extent of the famine, at least in certain regions. And of course there were conflicting reports which may have made them doubt these reports. But they still neglected to act on those reports they received. Why they didn't can't be known anymore. They're all dead for 70 years now. But does that make one innocent? Before I talked about the differences between murder, which is intentional killing, and manslaughter, which is unintentional killing. But you can still get a life sentence for manslaughter. For example, if you act reckless by speeding in front of a school, or alternatively by prioritizing grain quotas over reports of starvation. So maybe the UN definition sets the bar too high. People can only be punished if they definitely intended to let people die, not if they just let them die for the sake of industrialization. Personally, I've grown more skeptical towards the UN definition the more I thought about it. And the thing that made me think even more was the presumption of innocence. I think I was wrong to use it the way I used it in the previous section. I essentially assumed that Stalin and his government didn't intend to kill people, therefore it couldn't have been genocide. And when people pointed out that Stalin was informed about the starvation but ignored these letters, I said that this doesn't prove that he intended for them to die. This shows that having to prove intention gives potential criminals a way out. After all, it's easy to deny intention and almost impossible to prove it. So we may need to question whether this is a reasonable requirement for the crime at all. There's a case to be made for ignoring the intentions and just looking at the effect when examining tragedies like these. This isn't a traffic accident. Millions died. Should we really let those responsible hide behind the label of incompetence? In the end, back then, no matter how negligent Stalin acted, I just said that this didn't prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he wanted this to happen. It may be incompetence after all, which means there is no intention and that can't be a genocide. And I think this was because I was using the presumption of innocence wrongly. I assumed as long as he didn't intend for the suffering, he was innocent, which is the wrong way to think about this. Like, just because he doesn't fulfill one of the arbitrary definitions of genocide doesn't mean he didn't cause untold amounts of suffering. Even if his intentions were pure, his actions were not. And clinging onto the definition of genocide is wrong. Maybe he didn't intend to kill people, or maybe he did, but didn't target only Ukrainians. After all, more people died in the famine outside of Ukraine than inside. But even if it doesn't match the genocide definition, that definition may be wrong. And most importantly, his actions still fall under a criminal neglect and potential mass murder. So, to sum it up, I assumed the question of whether it was a genocide was a legal issue, not a moral one. I assumed the UN definition is right and that its burden of proof was correct. And I assumed Stalin was innocent until proven guilty, where I hyper-focused on his genocide definition and ignored all the other criminal classifications his actions may fall under. Let's now get to the arguments which argue for classifying the Holodomor as a genocide. A very common answer is that the famine was pretty convenient for the Soviet leadership. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union only existed for a good 20-ish years, and as you may know, communism is all about different ethnicities working together for the common good. But of course, just because Lenin was sitting in the Kremlin doesn't mean all the ethnicities of the Soviet Union suddenly wanted to work together. In some regions, nationalism took hold, and people openly opposed the Soviet approach of a centrally governed collection of member states. A region that showed extremely strong nationalism happened to be Ukraine. This was especially common under rural farmers, who considered the Soviet government no better than the one of the Tsar. And then there happened to be a famine that made the Ukrainian people completely unable to protest the Soviet government. So the argument goes that the Central Soviet government knew that mass starvation in rural Ukraine happened and let it happen to punish Ukrainians for nationalism and to deliberately let nationalists die. Of course, at this point we're assuming intent, but they may have very well just conveniently ignored the scattered reports of famine and just enjoyed that their enemies were conveniently all starving to death. Simon Payaslan, an Armenian-American historian at Boston University, said that the Holodomor is a genocide because there is a broad consensus among historians and scholars that says it was one. So people say it was a genocide, therefore it was one. My instinctive reaction to this was that he is stupid, this way to define genocide is stupid, and should be ignored. But wait a second. The reason I think that is because I already decided that genocide is a legal question. I assumed genocide is what the UN says, not what the consensus says. But is that right? We already established that the UN definition isn't great, and that using it and nothing else could be a very flawed approach. Basically, it's just a glorified appeal to authority. And as a matter of fact, I agree with this approach when it comes to many things. Words, for example. I think a word means what people say it means, not what some dictionary says. This is known as descriptivism, where we define something based on how the average person defines it. I happen to apply this logic when it comes to gender roles, for example. I don't listen to an authority telling me whether a skirt is manly or not. I instead judge that based on what people think. So why not apply the same to genocide? If, hypothetically, almost everyone agreed that the Holodomor was a genocide, that may make it one. After all, we wouldn't argue about definitions anymore if we all agreed. So is defining genocide by popular consensus a good approach or a bad one? You be the judge, this video is about thinking yourself. The Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who did research in the early 50s and who, by the way, invented the term genocide, also thought that the happenings in Ukraine in 1932 and 33 were equal to genocide. As a lawyer, he of course didn't use moral arguments, but legal ones, which personally I find more convincing because, as established above, I just can't stop thinking about this humanitarian tragedy in legal terms. He argues that the Holodomor was a deliberate attempt of the central government, which was made up of mostly ethnic Russians, to kill off the Ukrainian national spirit and traditions with the goal to turn Ukraine into an obedient part of Russia. Now, you may think that this is a nice accusation, but what evidence is there for it? Well, Lemkin argues that through the famine, Ukrainian culture was definitely hurt, a lot. Many of the folk traditions were only preserved by rural farmers, who happened to be the worst hit by the famine. Millions of them died, and with them their traditions. This alone may not show that the Soviet government deliberately did this, but before the famine, the Soviet government also destroyed the Ukrainian ruling class and harmed the Ukrainian church significantly by taxing them and stuff. And on top of that, Russians settled in some Ukrainian regions, especially in the east and on Crimea. Of course, you can explain all of those away with the USSR trying to implement socialist policies, but Lemkin sees them as evidence for an organized attempt to exterminate Ukrainian culture. So the famine would be one part in a Soviet genocide project. The last pro-genocide argument we will go into here is the one of robot conquest, who was a British historian working in the mid-80s, meaning he didn't have access to the Soviet archives yet. Those would only be open towards the end of the USSR under Gorbachev in the late 80s. Conquest said that the famine in Ukraine was deliberately inflicted on the Ukrainian people by the central government. As proof, he offers the fact that there are multiple letters from all across the Soviet Union that show that Stalin and his government were informed about the famine, yet ignored those reports and kept exporting grain and keeping it locked away from starving people. So the argument isn't that Stalin started the famine. Conquest thinks it was completely natural. The thing he blamed Stalin for is not intervening and saving the starving people. So the logic goes that Stalin was so willfully negligent, or even just too hyper-focused on industrialization, that it amounts to willful killing of an ethnic group. Sort of how forgetting to feed your children is legally almost equivalent to killing, therefore making it a genocide. On the other side of the debate, Mark Tauger, who's a professor of history at West Virginia University, had a look at the archival Soviet data in 1991 and concluded that the actual harvest in the famine was only 40% of what was reported. The conclusion being that the famine wasn't man-made like some during the Cold War said it was. Note that this doesn't mean that Stalin didn't mess up in his response to the famine. It just means that the famine wasn't man-made and thus cannot technically be called genocide. A very slimy defense of Stalin and his government is the one that says that genocide wasn't a crime yet in 1933. You see, the UN definition we used in the earlier sections was only ratified in 1948. And in most legal contexts, you can't retroactively make something illegal and then punish people for it. Shockingly, the same logic was used by the modern-day German government a few years ago, when the government of Namibia asked for compensation for the Herero genocide that the German Empire committed before World War I. The Germans straight up said it doesn't fall under genocide because it was before 1948. This is just really a legal dodge and nothing else. What I like about it is that it basically admits that the actions fell under the definition of genocide, and they tried to explain it away with the technicality. Matter of fact, this defense was used commonly during the Nuremberg trials by the Nazis. They said that the Holocaust wasn't illegal because there was no German law against it. To sum it up quickly, the persecution in Nuremberg argued that the Holocaust was so obviously wrong and against human morals that there didn't need to be a law declaring it wrong for it to be wrong. Therefore, all perpetrators of the Holocaust were punished, and this excuse was declared BS. Stephen Kotkin, who is a historian currently employed in Princeton University, says that the famine in Ukraine and the rest of the USSR was definitely an indirect result of the action of Stalin. Local leaders overreporting food production and rapid collectivization caused the famine, for example. But he doesn't believe that this falls under genocide. He, much like past me, said that there is no evidence Stalin deliberately killed those people. Some will reply that he clearly intended to kill people because if he didn't intend to, then he would have done something about it. So here intention is inferred from the result of the actions. Unfortunately, legally this is kind of inapplicable because it sort of says that the neglect was genocide because it was neglect, which doesn't convince Kotkin or me for that matter. It's a bit too circular. Let's now come to the argument that the Holodomor was deliberately perpetrated, or at least allowed to happen, in order to harm Ukrainian nationalism, or even the entire Ukrainian people, as the inventor of the term genocide argued. And I will concede that in the early 50s, while the Soviet government was still changing its policies all the time, it may have looked like this famine was deliberately orchestrated to destroy Ukrainian culture and replace them with Russians. But fortunately, we're now 60 years later, and it seems like Ukrainian culture survived. After the Holodomor, there were no supposed anti-Ukrainian plans committed by the central government. So, I think it's possible that the removal of the Ukrainian ruling class and the reduction of the church were done with the goal of socialism, not destruction of the Ukrainian people. Matter of fact, nationalism among groups like Ukrainians survived for so long that it collapsed the entire union in 1991. My point is that if the Soviet government genuinely tried to exterminate Ukrainians, they failed miserably. And I take this as a grain of evidence that maybe this wasn't their goal in the first place, and maybe the famine wasn't deliberate. Professor of economics at the University of Amsterdam, Mikkel Elman, wrote about the Holodomor in 2007. He says that the famine was probably probably natural, but the lack of support and to the starving people and the way to high grain requisitions constitute a whole variety of crimes. However, whether it should be called genocide completely depends on which definition you're using, which was also the thing my entire original argument hinged on. But he also warns that if we use a definition of genocide that doesn't include intent, and we just look at the effects of actions, then the Atlantic slave trade and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are also genocide. The same would go for economic sanctions like the blockade on Cuba. This is of course a road you could go down, just be aware you're seriously extending what counts as genocide if you remove intent. And what I believe to be the most persuasive argument that the Holodomor wasn't a genocide is that it didn't just hit Ukraine, it hit southern Russia, the Caucasus and Kazakhstan just as badly. And Stalin helped those places just as little. The counter often is that Ukraine was the worst hit region in the famine. Depending on who you ask, between 10 and 20% of Ukrainians died during these 2 years. But shockingly, this doesn't make it the most hit region. During the same time Ukraine was suffering from a famine, so was a significant part of Russia. And even worse hit was Kazakhstan, which was also a part of the Soviet Union, just like Ukraine was. And while Kazakhstan had fewer total deaths, up to 40% of ethnic Kazakhs died between 1931 and 33. This makes it by far the worst hit part of the USSR. The story here matches the one in Ukraine very closely. There was a natural famine that caused suffering, grain quotas that had to be hit no matter what, and targeted attempts to transform the Kazakh way of life into a more industrialized one. Stalin and the central government were informed about the famine, which even started 1 year before the famine in Ukraine, and they did nothing. There was a very interesting letter from Stalin which dismisses the reports of starvation as street rumors. Likewise, the government in Kazakhstan was not mainly made up of Kazakhs but rather Russians, which has caused some to suggest genocide. With all the things that the Holodomor has, a Russian ruling class enforcing the rules from a distant foreign authority and the Kremlin to reach goals which aren't realistic while over-reporting their success, in an attempt to speed up industrialization as a result of which millions died. It's really the same situation. But interestingly, there is no debate about whether this famine constituted a genocide. Nobody recognizes it as one, not even the government of Kazakhstan or Russia, even though every single argument you can make for the Holodomor being a genocide would also make the Kazakh famine a genocide. So, what's going on? Why does nobody care about these things when they happen in Kazakhstan? You could argue it's a sign of racism that Western news doesn't care for the lives of Central Asians, and that may be true, but that doesn't explain why the Kazakh government itself doesn't seem to care about declaring it a genocide. This issue is obviously complex, and feel free to give me your potential answers in the comment section, but I think the explanation is the following. The reason we care about the Holodomor and not about the Kazakh famine is because that's what the governments want. The Ukrainian government wants to distance itself from Russia, and the Kazakh government wants to be close to Russia. So the Ukrainian government blames Russia for the Holodomor, and the Kazakh government doesn't blame anyone, it just doesn't recognize it as an international issue. It's a political decision, not one based on legal or moral definitions of genocide. In conclusion, ever since the collapse of the USSR, Ukraine has moved away from Russia and towards the West, interacting with the EU and Interpol and even having some talks with NATO. And as a part of that, in the early 90s, after the independence from the USSR, the Ukrainian government sought to distance itself from Russia, who they say is the successor of the Soviet Union. This is also why countries like the USA, UK, France and so on recognize the Holodomor, while Russia and their allies don't. It's very much about which side you're on, and the West is on the side that the Holodomor was a deliberate genocide, and the East is on the side that it was mismanagement. This is why Kazakhstan, despite having the exact same history as Ukraine, doesn't blame Russia, because they're allies. So the depressing answer may be that the Holodomor recognition is just a political pawn in our post-Cold War political environment. I mentioned many assertions that define the Holodomor as a genocide, all of them from non-Russians. And it is to be noted that the counter-arguments are usually from people who lived in the Soviet Union, further showing that it's more about the reputation of the USSR and Russia than about finding out what happened. Ultimately, I showed you both sides, and I'm afraid there is no simple answer to the question of whether it was a genocide or not. Simply because, by today, all of the people from the time are dead. We can't interrogate or interview them. We can't have a Soviet officer confessing that the central government told them to starve people. And we can't know if Stalin's government was as unknowing as they may have said they were. The question is very convoluted and hard to answer, which is why I won't try. You can come to your own conclusion. Feel free to debate it in the comments, it boosts engagement. Thanks for watching. This was another long one. The statistics say you liked that. Also very big thanks to my patrons, because there's a 400% chance this video will be demonetized. Remember to subscribe and all the other stuff, and special thanks to Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, Attila Nemetz, Carissa, German Pineapple, Daniel Hyman, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gabi Gita, Herdington Gerdington, Josh C, Clastrup, Lilith Craft, Nana Epema, Nora Quinn, Ollie, Poach, Raman DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Roman Bryan, Sean Murphy, Silver, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef, and Trey.